folks, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to talk about the difference between private and commercial commissions, and this is something I've had quite a few questions about recently, so it seems like you all are curious. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, so I'm just going to jump right into defining private commissions. And I'm going to go over a few areas in each of these. So the client, who the client usually is, the deliverable, and the deliverable is like what the client is paying for, the thing that they're commissioning you for, what they're getting in the end in exchange for their money, and what they can use it for, what they can't use it for, what the process is like, and pricing. So I think that's 6 different categories. So for each of those, for private commissions and for commercial commissions, I'm going to go over each of those categories. So for private commissions, the client is usually an individual, though it could be a company using the work for a specific type of purpose. So we'll get into that when I talk about uses, but generally the client's an individual. Generally for a private commission, the deliverable, the thing that they're buying, is the actual original itself. So the work on canvas or paper or whatever you work on, they're actually taking home the physical work. That's what they're buying from you. So what they can use that for, what they can use that original work for, is for a display in their home so they can hang it up on their walls, or possibly in the office. So this is an example of how a company, a corporation or a business could commission you, but it would still, at least in the way that I categorize it, it would still fall under a private commission. So if the work is just being used for display on the wall in a home or office, to me that is a private commission, because the client doesn't have any rights to reproduce your work at all. So that gets into what they can't use it for. So if someone has commissioned you to create an original and they're paying you for the original, even though they commissioned you to create it and they're paying you for it, that doesn't give them the right to use it however they want. So they can't reproduce it, they can't make prints and sell those, they can't put it on mugs, they can't put it on merchandise, they can't use it as their logo. If it's a private commission, all they are getting is the original work itself, and all of those other rights belong to you. So and sometimes this is something you have to explain to a client, especially if it's an individual. So I get a lot of requests from people who are running small businesses, and they sort of assume that if they commission you to create an original, that's then theirs to do whatever they want with. But basically all they're paying you for is the physical work itself. So make sure in your agreement that you're clear on the fact that they're getting the original work, but that they're not getting any rights for distribution or reproduction or any of those things. So the process for a private commission is generally, for me anyway, the way that I do it is a sketch, and then they get a revision on the sketch, and then a color, and then they get a final revision for small tweaks on the color, and then that's it. So they get 2 opportunities for a revision, but depending on the kind of work that you do, you may want to have more opportunities or fewer opportunities. So it just kind of depends. That one is a personal choice, but for me it's generally sketch, revision, color, revision, and then the final. And then in terms of getting paid, I'm just realizing I left that out of the process. Actually, take a step back. What you should be getting is deposit, then sketch, then revision, then color, then revision, then final payment, and then you send them the final work. So basically you're getting 50% upfront before you start. And I find that this is especially important in private commissions, because if all the client is wanting to use it for is just decoration in their home or office, that is a little bit of a riskier situation for you as an artist, because if you're doing something for a magazine and you have the rights in your contract, if you have it spelled out that they don't have the right to use your illustration until they pay you, then they're definitely going to pay you. So the only times that I have had somebody just like straight up not refuse to pay, but like really drag their feet, I've always gotten the money in the end. But the times that I've had people drag their feet the most were on private commissions when I was first getting started and didn't understand how important it was to have that deposit, so that basically the client is already invested, so you know for sure that they're going to follow through. So yeah, deposit, sketch, revision, color, revision, final, then final payment, and then you ship it to the client. So I hope that makes sense. And then the last element here is pricing. And pricing for a private commission is fairly straightforward. It's based just on the work itself because that is what they're paying for. That, again, is kind of a personal, individual thing that varies from artist to artist. And things to consider when you're pricing are the size of the work, the materials you're using, how much those cost, your experience, how much time it's taking you, level of detail, all sorts of things. And again, if you're somebody who does maybe like more complex work with like scenery and narrative and all of that, you may have to do more revisions with the client. So that could increase your price as well if you're somebody who needs to do more than 2 revisions every time. So yeah, I can't tell you how to price your work, but I can say that those are some factors that you should consider. And again, I feel like I recommend this in every video, but I'm going to recommend the Graphic Artist Guild Handbook for Pricing and Ethical Guidelines because that is an excellent place to start for figuring out pricing. All right, so transitioning to commercial commissions, I'm going to go through these same categories. For a commercial commission, a client is usually a business, and that doesn't mean that it has to be like a corporation. It could be just a person who's running a bakery or a person who has a blog they make money off of, or it could be all the way up to a magazine or an advertising agency or a really big company. The deliverable, usually with a business, they are paying you for a digital image. So even if you're a traditional artist like me and you're making everything on paper, the client isn't actually usually going to see or have that work on paper. They're going to have, they're paying for a digital version of it. So the edited scan of your work. And this is because what the client uses your work for, what they get to use it for, is some version of reproduction. So they are getting to take your work and make other things out of it. So whether it is a logo for their business cards, for their letterhead, for signage, for packaging, for t-shirt, for other merchandise, whatever it is, they are paying you for the digital version of your work so that they can reproduce it somehow and make other things out of it that are related to their business. So that's kind of the key difference between, at least for how I categorize it, for between private commissions and commercial commissions. The private commission, they are just getting the physical work and they're not able to do anything else but hang it up on their wall and enjoy it. For commercial commissions, they are getting just the digital version and they are paying you for specific uses. So that means that they cannot use your work for anything that they're not paying you for. So again, if they pay you to be able to use it on a fabric pattern that they're making, that doesn't give them the right to use it as their logo. So I'm repeating myself here a lot because I know that this can be confusing and there are a lot of questions about this, especially if you're just getting started, but I hope that that is making sense, that if you can get in your mind that the client is paying you for the specific use, for a specific use or for a few specific uses, but that doesn't automatically give them the right to everything that you could possibly use the illustration for. That's the basic idea and what you want to be taking home from this. So the process for commercial commissions for me is generally about the same as it is for private commissions. You're going to have a sketch, you're going to have a revision, and then color, and then another final little revision, and then the finished work. The big difference here is that depending on the client, or a couple of the differences here, depending on the client, for me anyway, if I'm doing work for a magazine, for editorial work, I don't usually get a deposit for editorial work because the turnaround is so fast. So a lot of the time with editorial, they're looking for me to complete work in less than a week, almost always less than 2 weeks. So there isn't a lot of time to go through all of their billing department and getting a check issued or getting a bank transfer done. So I don't usually have deposits when I work with magazines, and that was something that made me uncomfortable at first, but at this point, because my contract includes a little line that says that they have no right to use the illustration unless they pay me, I'm comfortable with that, and I've always ended up getting paid. Sometimes it takes longer than I would like, but I've always had my editorial clients follow through on payment. So there's no deposit step first. with an editorial client. But if it's a larger client, like if it's for packaging, those projects a lot of the time take much longer, and they actually might even have additional revisions. So in those cases, I usually do get a deposit because the project is going to stretch way out, and it probably will include more revisions. And the reason it would include more revisions is because if it's for packaging, you're usually working with an agency, so there are more people involved. If it's editorial, you're just working with the one AD for the most part, the one art director. But for packaging, you could be working with an art director or a team of art directors and designers and the client. So there's a lot more people that have input. So that means that there are more revisions usually. And then for the deliverable, depending on the client, I may require that the client submit payment either electronically or by check before I send them a link to download. But sometimes I just send the link to download and then invoice them afterwards. And that is just kind of based on my judgment and whether I anticipate there potentially being any problem with the client not paying. And if I have any doubt, or if I'm concerned that the client might really drag their feet or not pay, then I always require payment first before I send them the digital download link. But in some cases, I just send it before I've received payment. I would say almost always when I'm doing editorial work, I have to send it before I receive payment just because their timeline is so tight. And then pricing for commercial work is different than pricing for private work, because for commercial work, you're not only including the actual work that it takes to make the piece, you're including basically the rights that the rights that the client needs, the ways that they're going to use the illustration, and that makes pricing quite a bit more complicated. So again, Graphic Artists Guild Handbook of Pricing and Ethical Guidelines is so important here. But the basic idea is that if you're making a new work for a commercial commission, you would probably you'd have kind of first your baseline price for just making the work. And that would be very similar to what you would charge if it was going to be a private commission. And then on top of that, you're going to be charging the client for the uses. So if the client wants to use it for a logo, that's going to be that would be more expensive than if the client wants to use it just on I don't know, like what's a really constrained use, like if the client just wants to use it in a magazine, for example, to illustrate an article, because a logo is going to be used all over that company's stuff. It's going to be used on their business cards, it's going to be used on their website, it's going to be used on their merchandise. Basically, if they're buying it to use it as a logo, they're going to want the exclusive rights, and they're going to want to be able to use that image however they want. So that should be more expensive than if it's a client who's just wanting to use it in a magazine to illustrate one article, but they're not going to be using it for anything else. So other things to consider besides how the client is using it is the size of the client. Because if it's a small company and they're just using it on like a little package for something that they make that they only really sell in a small region of the country, that's going to be they're going to have much less of a range than if it's a big international corporation who's using it on their packaging. So think of like how many eyes are going to be seeing your work, how many times that company is going to use it. So the larger the reach, basically, the more expensive the license should be. And there's another excellent resource for determining pricing related specifically to use that I have mentioned before, but I'll mention it again here, and that is Jessica Hish's article. I think it's Hish, I think that's how you say it, but it's actually a little essay called The Dark Art of Pricing, and it's so good. It's just really succinct, well written, has tons of helpful information, and I will link it in the description box below. And she goes into tons of detail about all of these things that I'm talking about. So I'm just kind of skimming over the top here. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, I would recommend reading that. And also you want to be sure to consider, if it is a commercial commission, not only the uses that the client is asking for, and not only the geography of the client, so whether they're local or regional or international, but also the length of the license and exclusivity. So if the client is just wanting to use it in a magazine, that's going to be a relatively short license, versus if a client is wanting to use it on packaging, they're probably going to want to use it for 5 years or more, and they may even want to use it in perpetuity, so forever. And exclusivity means that the client is the only one that can use the illustration for that purpose. So if the client has total exclusivity, that means that they're the only one that can use that illustration for any purpose at all. And that should be more expensive than if a client doesn't require any exclusivity. So if they're okay, they use the illustration for, an article on their blog, but they're fine if, anybody else uses the illustration as well. So that would be a non-exclusive license. You could also have exclusivity just for a particular area. So because I do so much food illustration, a lot of my clients are either magazines that have recipe articles or cooking segments, that sort of thing, or packaging and food packaging. So a pretty common request for me in a license is that that the client would have exclusivity in the food and beverage market. So that means I'm not going to license that illustration to anybody else that is making food and beverage products, but maybe I would license the illustration to somebody who's just making a t-shirt or something. So that's just a basic overview of what exclusivity means. Again, I would recommend the book that I mentioned and the Jessica Hish article that I mentioned. Both of those are great resources on this topic. So that was a fast and dirty overview of the difference between private and commercial commissions, and I really hope it was helpful. I'm sure I missed a ton of things, but again, just look up those articles, those resources for more in-depth information, and hopefully this was helpful. So let me know if you have other questions related to this topic or anything else, and I will do my best to answer them. And that is it. I hope you all have a great week, and thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!